Jason Carter sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the letter in his hands. The words blurred before him as tears stung his eyes. His rough fingers trembled slightly, crushing the paper just enough to show his frustration. He had read it 3 times already, but the message didn't change. The promotion he had worked tirelessly for, prayed for, and dreamed of had gone to someone else. Someone who didn't have his experience. Someone who hadn't run into burning buildings as many times as he had. Someone who wasn't him. The sun peeked through the thin curtains of his modest apartment, casting golden streaks on the faded carpet. Outside, the city was waking up, cars honking, birds chirping, and children laughing on their way to school. But inside Jason's small, quiet space, the world felt heavier, colder. He sighed deeply, folding the letter and tossing it onto the bedside table. "Guess it's not my turn," he muttered under his breath, though the words felt bitter and hollow. Jason had been a firefighter for nearly 15 years. He had seen it all: blazing infernos that lit up the night sky, families reunited with tearful hugs, and unfortunately, lives that couldn't be saved no matter how hard he tried. His reputation in the department was rock solid. Colleagues often joked that he had nerves of steel and a heart of gold. Yet, none of that seemed to matter when it came to moving up the ladder. Just yesterday, the chief had announced that Mark Reynolds, a younger firefighter with half Jason's experience, would be the new lieutenant. Mark was a decent guy, sure, but Jason knew the truth. Mark had connections, a father who had been a captain in the department, and Mark wasn't black. Jason's thoughts drifted to the countless times he had stayed late, taking on extra shifts to cover for others. He remembered the nights he missed family dinners and the mornings he woke up sore, muscles aching from pulling people out of danger. It had all been for this dream, a dream of climbing higher, of making his family proud, of proving to the world that a black man could lead just as well as anyone else. But now, that dream felt distant, like a flickering flame struggling to stay lit. "Dad, you okay?" Jason looked up to see his 12-year-old daughter, Mia, standing in the doorway. Her curly hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, and she was still in her pajamas. She held her favorite stuffed bear, the one she'd had since she was a baby. Her big brown eyes searched his face, full of concern. Jason forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm fine. Just thinking about work." Mia frowned. "Did something bad happen?" Jason hesitated. How could he explain to her what he was feeling? How could he tell her that, no matter how hard he worked, the world didn't always treat people like them fairly? He didn't want to burden her with that reality, not yet. "Nothing bad," he said finally. "Just a little disappointed, that's all." Mia climbed onto the bed and sat beside him. "You always tell me not to give up, even when things are hard," she said matter-of-factly. "Maybe you just need to try again." Jason chuckled softly. "Leave it to Mia to be the voice of reason." "You're right, kiddo. I'll keep trying." She grinned, leaning her head against his arm. "Good. You're the best firefighter in the whole city. They'll see it one day." Her words warmed his heart, even as doubt lingered in his mind. Jason wrapped an arm around her and kissed the top of her head. "Thanks, Mia. That means a lot." Later that day, Jason walked into the fire station, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. The familiar scent of smoke and sweat hung in the air. His colleagues greeted him with nods and smiles, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling of being invisible. Mark was in the corner, showing off his new lieutenant badge to a group of younger firefighters. Jason's chest tightened, but he pushed the feeling aside. He wasn't here for titles or recognition. He was here to do his job, to save lives. Still, as he suited up for another day, Jason couldn't help but wonder, how long could he keep this up? How long could he hold on to hope in a system that seemed determined to hold him back? The fire alarm blared, snapping him out of his thoughts. He grabbed his helmet and jumped into action. The world outside didn't care about promotions or politics. There were people who needed saving, and Jason Carter wasn't about to let them down. Jason Carter sat quietly at the back of the meeting room, his hands folded in his lap. The room buzzed with chatter as firefighters shuffled in, grabbing coffee and slapping each other on the back. The smell of fresh brewed coffee mixed with the faint odor of sweat that seemed to cling to the walls. It was a normal day at the fire station, but Jason's stomach was in knots. Chief Daniels stood at the front, his broad frame towering over the room. His voice boomed as he went over the agenda for the day: training schedules, equipment updates, and upcoming fire safety events. Jason listened carefully, taking mental notes, but his mind kept wandering. He knew what was coming. He could feel it. And lastly, Chief Daniels said, his tone shifting slightly, "Let's talk about leadership roles." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He straightened in his chair, trying to appear calm. This was his moment, or so he hoped. Chief Daniels' eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Jason before moving on. "Leadership is about more than just experience," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's about attitude, teamwork, and knowing when to step up. Some of you still have a lot to learn before you're ready for that kind of responsibility." Jason felt the weight of those words like a punch to the gut. He knew exactly who they were aimed at. His colleagues shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at him out of the corner of their eyes. Others avoided looking at him altogether. The unspoken tension hung heavy in the air. After the meeting, Jason found himself sitting alone in the break room. His coffee had gone cold, but he didn't care. The sting of Chief Daniels' words echoed in his mind. It wasn't the first time he'd faced this kind of treatment, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But that didn't make it any easier. "Rough meeting, huh?" Jason looked up to see Marcus, his closest friend at the station, leaning against the doorframe. Marcus was tall and lean, with an easy smile that could light up any room. But today, his smile was laced with concern. Jason nodded. "You could say that." Marcus grabbed a chair and sat down across from him. "You know he's full of it, right? Daniels doesn't see what we see. You're one of the best firefighters here, and everyone knows it." Jason shrugged. "Does it matter if he's the one making the decisions?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "It matters, Jason. You can't let him win. You've worked too hard to let someone like him hold you back. We got to keep fighting. For us, for the ones who come after us." Jason sighed. I don't know how much more of this I can take, Marcus. It feels like every step forward comes with 2 steps back." Marcus reached out and clasped Jason's shoulder. "I get it, man. Believe me, I do. But you're stronger than this. You've got people who believe in you. And whether Daniels likes it or not, you're a leader. Don't let him make you forget that." Jason looked into his friend's eyes and saw the determination there. It was a spark of hope, small but steady. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe the fight wasn't over yet. As the day went on, Jason threw himself into his work, channeling his frustration into action. The fire station was his battlefield, and every life he saved was a victory. He might not have a title, but he had a purpose. And for now, that was enough to keep him going. Jason had never felt so defeated. The fire station buzzed with activity, but he moved through it like a shadow. News of Sam's promotion had spread quickly. Jason's colleagues congratulated Sam with handshakes and pats on the back. Jason tried to smile, but his heart wasn't in it. How could it be? He had been overlooked again, and this time it stung even more. Sam was a good firefighter, but Jason knew the truth. Sam wasn't ready for leadership. He lacked the experience, the calm under pressure, the ability to make tough decisions in the heat of the moment. But he had one thing Jason didn't: a personal connection to Chief Daniels. "Jason, can I talk to you for a second?" Jason turned to see Chief Daniels standing in the doorway of his office. His heart sank. He didn't want to talk, but he knew he had no choice. He followed Daniels into the office and closed the door behind him. "I'm sure you've heard about Sam's promotion," Daniels began, leaning back in his chair. Jason nodded. "I've heard." Daniels folded his hands on his desk. "Look, Jason, I know you're disappointed. But leadership isn't just about experience. It's about potential, about the ability to grow into the role. Sam has that potential." Jason's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, Chief, I've been here for 15 years. I've proven myself time and time again. How is that not enough?" Daniel sighed, his expression unreadable. "Jason, it's not about you. It's about what's best for the department." Jason felt a surge of anger. Is it really about the department? Or is it about something else? Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What are you trying to say?" Jason hesitated for a moment, then decided to speak his truth. I'm saying that it feels like my race is the reason I keep getting passed over. I've worked just as hard, if not harder, than anyone else here. But it's never enough. Daniels leaned forward, his tone sharp. That's a serious accusation, Jason. I suggest you think carefully about what you're implying. Jason met his gaze, refusing to back down. I don't have to imply anything. The pattern speaks for itself. The room fell silent. Daniels finally leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry you feel that way, Jason, but the decision is final. Jason stood, his hands clenched into fists. Thank you for your time, Chief, he said, his voice tight. He turned and walked out of the office, his heart pounding. Later, Jason sat in the locker room, his head in his hands. Marcus found him there, his expression filled with concern. You okay? Marcus asked, sitting down beside him. Jason shook his head. I don't know, man. I don't know if I can keep doing this. It's like no matter what I do, it's never enough. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. Listen, Jason. I know it's hard, and I know it's not fair, but you can't give up. You've come too far to let them break you. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for every kid out there who needs to see that it's possible to make it, no matter what the odds are. Jason looked at his friend, his chest tightening with emotion. Thanks, Marcus. I needed that. Marcus smiled. Anytime. Now let's get back out there. The world doesn't stop turning just because we're having a bad day. Jason nodded, a small spark of determination reigniting in his heart. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The fire call came in the middle of the night, piercing through the quiet like a siren in a storm. Jason's phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling him out of a restless sleep. His heart raced as he answered the call and got the details. A massive fire had broken out in an upscale neighborhood. Multiple homes were at risk, including one belonging to someone he never expected to think about in a crisis. Chief Daniels. Jason threw on his gear, his mind racing faster than his hands. It was a firefighter's duty to protect lives and property, no exceptions. But tonight felt different. The thought of rushing to save the home of the man who had overlooked him so many times stirred something deep inside him. Could he set aside his frustration and pain to do what he had sworn to do? By the time Jason arrived at the scene, flames were already licking the night sky. The fire roared like an angry beast, devouring everything in its path. The air was thick with smoke and chaos. Firefighters shouted orders, hoses sprayed water, and neighbors watched in horror as their lives burned before their eyes. Jason grabbed his gear and ran toward the command post. Chief Daniels was there, his face pale, but his voice steady as he directed the response. For a moment, their eyes met. Jason saw something in Daniels' expression he hadn't seen before: fear. Not for himself, but for his family. Carter, Daniels called out, his voice cracking. Get a team to the west side. My wife and kids, they're still inside. Jason froze for half a second, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Then, without a word, he nodded and turned to his team. Let's move. We got people inside. The heat was unbearable as Jason led his team into the burning house. The smoke was so thick it felt like it was clawing at his lungs. Every step was a battle, but Jason pushed forward. He wasn't thinking about Daniels or the promotions or the years of being overlooked. He was thinking about the people trapped inside. That was all that mattered. They found the family huddled in a bedroom, coughing and terrified. Jason's team worked quickly, guiding them out one by one. Jason carried the youngest child, a little boy no older than 6, cradling him against his chest as they navigated the smoke-filled halls. The boy clung to him tightly, his tiny hands gripping Jason's jacket. When they finally emerged into the cool night air, the family's relief was palpable. Daniels rushed over, his face a mixture of gratitude and guilt. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jason nodded, too exhausted to speak. He handed the boy to Daniels and turned back toward the flames. There was still work to be done. The fire raged like a wild beast, devouring everything in its path. The flames reached high into the night sky, turning it an eerie shade of orange. Jason Carter arrived at the scene with his team, the blaring sirens barely audible over the roaring inferno. The heat hit him like a wall as he stepped out of the truck, his gear feeling heavier than usual. "All right, team," Jason said, his voice calm but firm. "We got a big one here. Let's focus and work fast. Lives depend on us." His team nodded, their faces set with determination. Jason had worked with them long enough to know their strengths. He trusted them, and they trusted him. Even if the higher-ups didn't see his leadership potential, his team did. The scene was chaos. Neighbors stood on the sidewalks, some crying, others holding each other as they watched their homes burn. Jason's eyes scanned the area, taking in the magnitude of the fire. It was one of the worst he'd ever seen. "Carter, we've got someone trapped in that house," one of his teammates called out, pointing to a two-story home engulfed in flames. Jason didn't hesitate. "Let's move," he said, grabbing his axe and leading the way. The heat was intense as they approached the house. Smoke billowed out, making it hard to see. Jason pulled his mask on and entered the building, his team close behind him. Inside, the air was thick, the smoke stinging his eyes even through the mask. He could hear the crackling of the fire and the groaning of the house as the flames consumed it. "Over here," a voice called out faintly. Jason followed the sound, navigating through the smoke-filled rooms. In the corner of what used to be a living room, a man was trapped under a fallen beam. "Hang on," Jason said, kneeling beside the man. "We're going to get you out of here." Jason signaled for his team, and together they worked to lift the beam. It was heavy, and the fire was spreading fast. Sweat poured down Jason's face as he strained to lift the beam just enough to free the man. Finally, they pulled him out and carried him toward the door. As they exited the house, a loud crash behind them signaled the collapse of the roof. Jason turned to see flames shooting out of the building, debris flying everywhere. His heart pounded, but he didn't stop moving. The man's life was in his hands. They laid the man down on the grass, and paramedics rushed over to take him. Jason took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His body ached, and his lungs burned from the smoke, but there was no time to rest. "Jason, we've got another house at risk," one of his teammates said. Jason nodded. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Throughout the night, Jason led his team with unwavering focus. He barked orders, made quick decisions, and ensured that everyone worked together. It was exhausting, but Jason felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about promotions or recognition. He was thinking about the people who needed him. As the sun began to rise, the fire was finally under control. Jason stood with his team, covered in soot and sweat, but there was a sense of accomplishment in the air. They had done their job, and they had done it well. One of his teammates clapped him on the back. "Great job, Jason. We couldn't have done it without you." Jason smiled faintly. "We're a team. That's what matters." As he looked at the remains there, Jason felt a spark of hope. The fight wasn't over, but for now, he had won this battle. The fire was finally under control. The relentless blaze that had consumed the area was now a memory of past, leaving behind charred ruins and heavy hearts. Jason Carter stood amidst the wreckage, his body aching and his mind racing. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the weight of the night was sinking in. Soot clung to his skin, mixing with sweat to form streaks on his face. His gear felt impossibly heavy, but he couldn't bring himself to take it off just yet. As Jason surveyed the destruction, his eyes landed on the remains of Chief Daniel's mansion. What had once been a grand home, a symbol of power and privilege, was now a skeleton of its former self. Smoke curled up from the blackened beams, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt wood and melted metal. "Carter," a voice called out, breaking through his thoughts. Jason turned to see Chief Daniels approaching. The man looked unrecognizable. His usual crisp uniform was gone, replaced by soot-covered clothes. His face was streaked with ash, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and exhaustion. Jason stood still as Daniels approached, unsure of what to expect. The chief stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the ruins of his home. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words and lingering tension. Finally, Daniels broke the silence. "It's all gone," he said, his voice low and shaky. "Years of work, memories, everything." Jason nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, Chief. Fires don't choose who they hurt." Daniels turned to look at Jason, his expression hard to read. "You saved my family," he said after a pause. "I don't know how to thank you for that." Jason shrugged. "It's my job. That's what we do." Daniels nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something deeper. He looked back at the ruins of his home, his shoulders sagging under the weight of loss. "I was angry," he admitted, "when I saw the damage. I thought about the things I'd lost. But then I realized none of that matters. My family is alive because of you." Jason didn't know what to say. The words felt strange coming from Daniels, a man who had overlooked him time and time again. But there was sincerity in his voice that Jason couldn't ignore. "You're a good firefighter, Carter," Daniels said, his voice steadying. "Better than I've given you credit for. I see that now. You're not just good, you're exceptional." Jason looked at Daniels, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But all he saw was a man who had been humbled by loss and fear. "Thank you, Chief," Jason said quietly. "That means a lot." Daniels nodded. "I should have seen it sooner. You've been leading this team for years, whether or not you had the title. Tonight proved that." Jason felt a lump rise in his throat. For years, he had worked tirelessly, hoping for recognition that never came. And now, standing in the ashes of a neighborhood, he was finally hearing the words he had longed for. As the sun began to rise, casting a soft light over the destruction, Daniels extended his hand. Jason hesitated for a moment before taking it. The handshake was firm, a silent acknowledgement of respect and gratitude. "We've got a lot of rebuilding to do," Daniels said, his voice quieter now. "But I think we've also got a lot to learn from this." Jason nodded. "One step at a time, Chief." As Daniels walked away, Jason stood alone for a moment, letting the weight of the night settle over him. The fight wasn't over, not with the fire, not with the system, and not with himself. But for the first time in a long time, Jason felt a spark of hope. He wasn't just a firefighter. He was a leader. And maybe, just maybe, the world was starting to see it too. The meeting room was crowded, the air thick with tension and the scent of freshly brewed coffee. Jason Carter sat near the front, his hands resting on the table. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained calm. Today was the day he had been waiting for, the chance to speak out. Chief Daniels stood at the head of the room, his expression stern but weary. He glanced around at the department leaders and senior firefighters. "We're here to discuss the next round of promotions and the direction of this department," Daniels began. "It's been a challenging few weeks, but we've come through it stronger." Jason couldn't hold back any longer. He raised his hand, and Daniels nodded reluctantly. Jason stood, his tall frame commanding attention. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. "With all due respect, Chief," Jason began, his voice steady, "we can't talk about moving forward without addressing the past." Daniels frowned slightly. "Go on." Jason took a deep breath. "For years, I've watched as firefighters with less experience, less dedication, and less ability have been promoted over me and others like me. And the only difference I can see is the color of our skin." A murmur rippled through the room, but Jason pressed on. "I've worked here for 15 years. I've led teams into burning buildings. I've saved lives. I've missed birthdays, anniversaries, and so many moments with my family to serve this department. But none of that seems to matter when it comes to recognition." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but Jason held up a hand. "Let me finish, Chief. This isn't just about me. This is about fairness. This is about making sure that every firefighter, no matter their background, has the same chance to succeed. It's about doing what's right." The room was silent. Jason could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. He looked around, meeting the eyes of his colleagues. Some looked uncomfortable, others thoughtful. But one face stood out. Marcus, his closest friend, nodded in quiet support. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Jason continued. "I'm asking for equal treatment. I'm asking for a department that values hard work and dedication over connections and bias." Marcus stood, his voice strong. Jason's right. We've all seen it. It's time we do better. Not just for him, but for everyone who comes after us. One by one, other firefighters began to speak up, sharing their own frustrations and stories. The room, once silent, was now alive with voices calling for change. Jason felt a flicker of hope. Chief Daniels raised a hand, quieting the room. He looked at Jason, his expression unreadable. Carter, he said slowly, you've given me a lot to think about. And I think you're right. We need to do better. I need to do better. Jason nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen. The fight wasn't over, but this was a start. As the meeting ended, Marcus clapped him on the back. Proud of you, man. You did it. Jason smiled faintly. We did it, and we're just getting started. The fire station was quiet, the early morning sunlight streaming through the windows and illuminating the empty hallways. Jason Carter stood in front of his locker, staring at the neatly folded uniform that now bore the insignia of a lieutenant. It had finally happened. After years of being overlooked, of fighting against a system that seemed determined to hold him back, Jason had earned the promotion he deserved. But as he held the uniform in his hands, he couldn't ignore the bittersweet ache in his chest. This victory, while long overdue, wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been made to feel invisible, who had been told in subtle and not so subtle ways that they weren't enough. Jason's fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Chief Daniels appeared in the doorway, his face lined with exhaustion, but carrying a hint of something else, respect. Carter, Daniels said, his voice steady. Congratulations. You earned it. Jason turned to face him, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Chief. That means a lot. Daniels hesitated, then stepped further into the room. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about fairness and how this department operates. You were right. We've been blind to things we should have seen a long time ago. I should have seen them. Jason nodded slowly. It's not easy to change, Chief, but it's necessary. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. We're starting with small steps, new measures for diversity and inclusion, better training for leadership. It's not enough, but it's a start. Jason allowed a small smile to tug at the corners of his mouth. It's a good start. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past and the hope for the future hanging in the air. Finally, Daniels extended his hand. Jason took it, their handshake firm and sincere. As Daniels left, Jason turned back to his uniform. He ran his fingers over the insignia, feeling the pride and responsibility it represented. This wasn't just a promotion. It was a promise to himself, to his family, and to everyone who would come after him. Later that day, as Jason stood at the front of the firehouse, the sun warm on his face, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. He had fought for his place, and he had earned it. But more importantly, he had sparked a conversation that couldn't be ignored. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Jason was ready. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, ready to lead, ready to inspire, and ready to be the change he had always dreamed of.